So, should I do the intro or do you want to do it?
I'll do it.
Okay.
Hello, ladies and germs, and welcome to another scintillating tale of Planetary from the fine folks at Never Stay Dead. I am one of two co-hosts, Matt, along with my good friend who sounds like this.
Hey, it's Damian, sometimes known as Sleepy Reader. The other fine folk, I guess. One of the germs.
Yeah, there you go.
At least I don't think I'm a lady. You never know these days.
And today we're talking about issues 6 and 7 of Planetary, which was extra lifting for me because it is the end of Trade 1 and the start of Trade 2. I don't know.
Yes.
I got to work out.
It must have been confusing. You're reading a book and then you have to read another book.
Oh my gosh, it's like homework.
And I have been going kind of crazy in my new love affair all over again with Planetary and buying up all the single issues. So I read it in my expensive omnibus, and then I bought some cheap copies of the original issues, which I'm holding in my hand right now.
What are the issues going for?
They seem to go between $3 and $5 at stores around me.
Okay, so kind of like used comic prices anymore, just a little above.
Yeah, I think they're the standard price, and the shops around me normally have 50% off sales 3 or 4 times a year. So in that case, I would normally have bought them for $2.50 or something, but I couldn't wait because with COVID, we haven't had any of those sales for quite a long time.
Ugh, yeah, I'm worried because I'm getting this itch to do a big it's not Black Friday, it's Small Business Saturday. A couple places near me will do like stuff in the back issue bins are $1.
Right.
And I'm worried they're not going to do it this year. And how am I gonna buy every Fantastic Four comic they have if it's not going for $1 a pop?
Yes, you've been on a Fantastic Four run or a binge, I guess is the right word.
A little bit, yeah.
I've works perfectly with this first issue that we're going to look at.
Yeah.
Planetary number 6, which is called 4, I believe.
Yeah, which is confusing.
The number 4.
Right.
How did you think of it as confusing?
Well, because it's chapter 6, but it's
that is
4. But it's, if you move that little down, actually, the title says it's a strange up.
It's a strange world.
Yeah, it's a strange world, and then 4, a planetary story.
Yeah, for some reason I thought the title was just 4, but maybe it's a strange world.
It's also doubly confusing in the trade.
Okay.
This is terrible podcasting, but in the trade it's presented, you have the cover and then you have this first page, and this first page is a full spread of a pixelated eyeball with looking at the snowflake.
But that is the splash page of the original issue.
Right. But just next to the cover without knowing, it just looks like another cover.
Oh, I see. You're right. It looks like another cover. I was thinking it looks like an ad, strangely like an ad to me. At first I did a double take, like, is this, because it doesn't look like a drawing, right? It looks like a digitally manipulated picture.
Right. I mean, I can tell it's drawn.
Yeah. And I'm not sure. It's an eyeball seeing the snowflake with the snowflake reflected in the pupil. I have to say, until my second or third read of it, I did not notice that was the snowflake.
Oh, okay.
Make that connection right away. I don't know why, because sometimes when you look at a close up of an iris, it kind of has these lines in it and stuff. You know what I'm saying? Under a microscopic kind of look. I don't know. Anyway, I eventually realized it was the snowflake. So this issue, I mean, let's lay it right out there. This issue is about an evil Fantastic Four that exists in the Planetary universe, and I guess thus in the Wildstorm universe.
Wow. Wow, jump to the
Is
lead.
that too much?
No, you are not wrong, but I think the buildup here is actually fairly interesting because this is one of the planetary issues that actually plays on a different kind of um pop culture idea, or maybe not even fully pop
Mhm.
culture, long before. By the time we get to the Fantastic Four, the issue's like 2/3 over.
Right. Well,
So
except that the cover and then the title 4 and the picture with 4 astronauts. I don't
yeah,
know. My mind
foreshadowing.
jumped immediately to the Fantastic Four, but maybe other people's minds would not.
Well, you're right with the cover and the title for, but as far as the meat of the issue, we open on the drummer talking about the space race in
Right.
light of the Cold War. And so there's a lot made of Nazi scientists being brought to the US, how people are taking issue with that. And
It's a
people, by people, I mean planetary.
it's a super paranoid narrative of a secret government on top of our government
I don't know
that
if it's
is,
paranoid.
well,
Is it?
not paranoid in the case of this book, but I feel like it's a reference to people's paranoid ideas about secret government cabals that have been floating around. I mean, now it's all a different kind of thing with QAnon, but it used to be a very popular idea that there was this secret government far above, at a level, they describe it here as 11 levels above the president's need to know. Um,
Mhm.
so there, I don't know, when I was growing up in the 70s anyway, and maybe 80s, I always heard about these people who believed there was this secret government even the president didn't know about that was really running things.
There is that, but it's also mixed in with these Nazi scientists coming in and helping us
Right.
win the space race against the communist Russians. And also how, while there's all this forward facing stuff about the more public stuff, the manned space missions and whatnot, there's also this Project Artemis that was doing a lot of work and a lot of potential ne'er-do-wells or going
Right.
wrong.
Based on secret Nazi scientists that no one knew their names, who were the closest people to Hitler in the world, and then were brought over to the US
But
in secret.
that part's history. That's real.
No. There are real Nazi scientists who came over, but it's not that no one knows their names or that
Oh,
they
well,
live
yeah.
in close. So they mentioned the real life Nazi scientists
Mhm.
who came and helped us with the space race. And then they say there were some even more brilliant super genius Nazi scientists that no one knew about who
Right.
also came over. So it is still this secret shadow version of things above and beyond what anybody knows about, for sure.
Yeah, and it is just weird that in the comic with Planetary, with their long, like even Elijah Snow being alive for the entire century, the idea that they're so disgusted that the US brought in Nazi
Right.
scientists, when American history would show that if you were around before the war, it wouldn't have been a big deal because we were on the brink of bringing in fascism ourselves. It is a
Right.
little weird to read.
Well, and so weirdly, there's two space races going on, and the secret one is far in advance of the real one, because in the reality, in the one that the public knows about, we got to the moon in 1968, right? I think it was
Yes.
68. But in this one that no one knows about, they got to the moon in 1960 or maybe 61. But they were already on the moon when the 4 went on their mission, which never made it to the moon. And
Right.
when they came back, they weren't human. Dun dun dun.
They're the 4, but
And it's interesting because I think some of the things were shown while Drummer is narrating their history.
Mhm.
If I can find it, because they interleave the drummer sort of giving a what do you call it when you prep people before they go on a mission, kind of giving a presentation on everything they know about the 4.
Mhm.
So while he's speaking, and maybe these are supposed to be photographs that they've uncovered that were taken. So they, on their way to the moon, they encountered a snowflake in space.
Right.
I.e., the snowflake-esque image that keeps reoccurring in different ways in these stories, not a real life snowflake, of course.
Mm-hmm.
For those who haven't been listening to the other episodes of this podcast, which is always possible. So yeah,
Sure.
so instead of, the Fantastic Four were changed by cosmic rays. Instead, one presumes, it's not said explicitly, that they were transformed by this encounter with a snowflake or the snowflake.
What's really interesting to that is, as we see the snowflake as we have thus far, it's blue with a potential like red in the center, like an offset, like a center vortex kind of deal. But when you flip over, when the four go through it, it becomes this like red, bloody.
Oh yeah, and it doesn't look so much like a snowflake anymore.
Yeah,
it also almost reminds me of like a churning thing, like they're being chopped up by it or something.
Yeah, it looks bloody. It looks visceral.
And then when their spaceship is found, I mean, our narrative from the drummer says they were no longer completely human, but what we see is their spacesuits cut off just above the waist, and some maybe goo or smoke gas in there.
Right.
So were they actually transformed into something, have they, I couldn't tell from this picture. First time I read it, I thought they were no longer in their spacesuits. They'd left the space capsule before it was picked up. But then I started to wonder, are they this goo that appears coming out of the spacesuits, and they're just creatures of goo?
I took it to mean like they're out of their spacesuits. We don't get to see their final form because we only actually see one of them in this comic.
Right.
Post the accident.
Right. So I guess those are just ripped spacesuits. So that might just be the way it was drawn, and it's colored to be in black and white, sort of sepia colors. So there's no... Because when it said they're no longer human, and I just see this bottom half of spacesuits, I just wasn't sure what I was supposed to make of that. Like, had they lost their human form, but then they can take on a human form when they want to. So they are four characters who seem analogs for the familiar Reed Richards, Ben Grimm, Johnny Storm, and Sue Storm. And they are the lead guy is Randall Dowling, a physicist who looks a bit like Reed Richards. And then, excuse me. And then there's Jacob Green, the pilot, which they give him Jack Kirby's first name. And I made that connection. I don't know if they intended that. Jack Kirby's real name was Jacob Kurtzman, or Kurtz something. Kurtzberger or Kurtzman, I can't remember.
But for the sake of the story, they couldn't give him any Jewish-sounding name.
Right, that's true. They're supposed to be Nazis. And William Leather is the flight engineer. And that name is so specific, I keep feeling it's a reference to something. And then Kim Suskind would be the blonde Sue Storm type, although she has her hair tied up in a tight bun. And she is the daughter of one of these original unknown, unnamed super German scientists. Which implies to me I was wondering if Randall Dowling was supposed to be one of the original German scientists, but maybe not. He's a physicist, engineer, you name it. List of disciplines as long as your arm. I think later they say he could have been the next Einstein, except for some problem in his background. They might have let Dowling be the American Einstein if not for his background, but they don't tell us what his background is. So that's why I thought he might be one of the Nazi super scientists.
I mean, even if he's not one of the Nazi super scientists, he's in lineage of. They all are.
Right. He's part of their secret world. And Leather, the guy who is the Johnny Storm's stand-in, William Leather, has a hazy history hinting at involvement in exotic airplane design. And there was a woman in Florida who swore to her dying day that she and Leather were the last people to ride in the Nautilus in 1959. And the Nautilus, of course, is from the Jules Verne novel 2,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which would have been invented when, I forget when that novel came out, but it was supposed to be, it was Jules Verne predicting the invention of the submarine in a sense. It was before any submarines were invented when that novel was done.
And so again, we get this incredible pull of all these ideas of politics to explorers to futurism being weaved throughout, even with some of the smaller references. Like the amount of work and detail that's going in here is pretty incredible.
Right. It's very dense. I found, of the issues we've read recently, I found this one of the, I had to reread the overview that Drummer is giving us a couple of times to kind of track it all. And sort of intermixed with that story, we have Chiquita and Elijah Snow going to the Four Voyagers Plaza, which we find out they have located as one of the secret labs of the Four from their adventure on Monster Island, or Island Zero, as it's called in this comic. So apparently, I mean, they didn't tell us about that in the issue of Island Zero, but apparently there were clues there that led them to learn more about the hidden places, or at least some of the hidden places of the Four. Kind of on the nose that we never figured that they might be in a place, a giant building called the Four Voyagers Plaza. But anyway, so it's kind of like the Baxter Building or something like that. They own the top of the building.
What kind of struck me about this too is I think it'd be easy to read this as like a parody or like a take on the Fantastic Four and how there could be a negative tone to it. But what's really telling here is that this is the Fantastic Four taken and perverted very intentionally with a number of things. Like it's very knowing in that way, in a way that I don't think plays on parody, but on playing with the principle. In a way, this is replacing the idea of using a Superman as a jumping off point, but pointing more to the Marvel Age is when this new idea kind of swings in.
It kind of retrofits the Fantastic Four into our world. Even though this is the Wildstorm world, it explains how they could have been going on a flight to the moon in 1961, even though we never did it till 1968, and how they could have come back with superpowers, but we don't know about it. So this is a Fantastic Four that could exist in our world. So it's kind of an interesting thought experiment of like, how would you fit these kinds of superheroes into our world?
Well, and I got a more visceral political sense of this than from the Fantastic Four life story comics that have been coming out.
Yeah, and it also explains how would you pay for all of this? They're siphoning off Black Ops money from the U.S. And that's where this, because in Life Story by the Fantastic Four, if I remember correctly, they just on their spare time built a spaceship.
Sure, why wouldn't you?
Where'd the money come from? Anyway, although I guess the money was okayed in the Life Story by John F. Kennedy, and then the program got cut, and then they snuck on their spaceship. Anyway, I feel like it's clever. I do wonder, is he taking a stand against Marvel Comics here? But probably not. It's just, I think, an interesting thought experiment for him.
There's too many things that are playing on this idea, like if the Fantastic Four is done another way. Like there's a file on the 4, and there's this etching around the 4 that's like turning it into a swastika.
Where is that?
I think ahead for you are by a page.
Okay. Also
There's
on the cover, it looks like maybe a window of their spaceship has both a American flag and a Nazi Iron Cross.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these things I don't notice on the first reading. So there's are we talking about something that the planetary people have, or something they find?
It's the Planetary File.
Okay.
If you
did I go too far?
Go back.
It's confusing because the story parts are interleaved. There
it's
it
right
is.
There.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So it's like it got smudged and it's starting to look like the Nazi swastika.
Yeah. And
really brilliant coloring too, which separates the sort of the flashback from the current action. And this is one of the first issues where there is some all-out action with our superpowered characters, not just talking to somebody.
Yes. And when they're talking about that file, Snow says, I don't like killing people. I want to kill these people. After looking at the file, again, that's really showing that these characters are despicable Nazi types that had the opportunity to use this rocket. But this is the idea of the Fantastic Four used in a different way. This is not the Fantastic Four in any way.
Although, other than yeah, sorry, I should let you finish that. I thought.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say at this same scene where Snow says, the things these scum have cost us since 1961. I don't enjoy killing people. I want to kill these people. Although they've told us they are part of an old Nazi thing that the U.S. imported, they have not told us what these scum have done that he read that's so bad.
And we're not going to.
Right.
Which
kind of left me wondering, does he know for sure what Planetary has done?
I mean, he will.
Because the other thing is, by the end of this issue, I was thinking, or maybe Leather, who they confront later, even says something like, we're the other side of things than you. The 4 are kind of similar to the 3. And in fact, there's a supposed 4th man in Planetary.
Right.
And maybe, who is actually the good guys here? We don't really know, although we've been told these people come out of a Nazi program, so it seems like they're clearly the bad guys. But anyway, I can't remember how that resolves. Although I think they become clearly the bad guys.
Well, what's more interesting, though, is this Leather character has been watching Elijah Snow and knows who he is and knows what he's about and seems to have more knowledge than Snow has, because there's a bit of amnesia we're playing.
They've met before and such.
Right. So there's something here. And again, it's tied to a major war. It's tied to these events. It's a little piece in the greater mystery coming from here.
Yeah. Yeah. So Elijah and Jaquita wander through the not Baxter building, the Four Voyagers building, or the penthouse laboratories. They see some stuffed subterraneans who are like the moloids from Mole Man, the first villain of the Fantastic Four. They see a giant painting with a stairway going up to it of a cosmos, which kind of evokes, even on an even grander scale than one sees in the Fantastic Four, at least the versions I've read, that kind of portal they have going into the negative zone. Now, you've read a lot more recent Fantastic Four. I don't know if this has something to do with stuff you've read in the Mark Waid run or anything.
I haven't gotten to the Mark Waid run.
Oh, okay. You've been collecting the Mark Waid run, but you haven't gotten to it And then when they come across Leather, he's kind of stooped over some machinery in a really cool kind of futuristic technology setting with what later turns out to be a window. I thought it might be another portal there. But I was struck by it because this is, by now, I think most experienced comic book readers at this point in the comic know it's the Fantastic Four, right? But this is all this wild machinery, and it does not look like Kirby tech. They're not. So that's another one of my many tips of the hat to Cassaday. He manages to do this wild technology without directly referencing Jack Kirby, which is what most people have to do because Jack Kirby's machinery was so overwhelming. It's hard for other people to think of something else that's any good. So I thought that was a really cool, particular favorite image of mine there. Although the art throughout is fantastic. So then Jaquita fights Leather, and so Leather must not only have kind of firepower, but he must be very strong and hard to hurt because she doesn't manage to hurt him. And he kind of has blue flames, and he just throws her out a window, which I guess is probably like 50 stories high or something.
My guess on the thinking there is blue is a hotter flame than
yes, I
orange
thought
or
the
red.
same thing. Yeah, blue is a hotter flame than your orange and red flames are not as hot. Yeah, so here he is, full bore on fire.
Sorry, I got excited. I saw an ad for Battle Chasers.
Is that a comic?
Oh yeah.
Okay, I didn't know if it was
Never
a comic
finished.
or a game. Never finished. Oh, interesting. Okay, well, we can save that for another podcast, I guess.
Yeah.
So when Leathers removes his beard with his flaming finger, to me, that's a reference from, I think, Fantastic Four #4, where Johnny Storm finds Namor, the Submariner, as a bum on Skid Row with a beard, and he uses his finger to burn off Namor's beard. I'm assuming that's where they got that idea, but maybe not. And he right away knows who Jaquita is, and he knows who Elijah Snow is, and they have a fight. Elijah fights dirty and kicks him between the legs. And I'm trying to focus here, but they kick in the unmentionables. You've changed, Mr. Snow. You don't know me. Oh, yes, I do. I've known you for far too long. And we're leaving you alive because this new train of events amuses us. So it's like the four were never in any danger from him.
Mm-hmm.
And then he seems to sort of go supernova, or not supernova, but blazing hot, sort of almost blinding Elijah. And then we see a almost fetus-like figure in the middle of the snowflake. I don't know if that's what Elijah's seeing or not.
I don't know quite what we're supposed to get out of that one.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting because this, what is it? It's issue 7 or 6. This is the first time the snowflake now seems to be almost as if is it on the side of these evil people, or they've harnessed it, perhaps. Right. We are all the things. We are all the secret history of the planet, for we are its secret chiefs. For you to ask yourself it's time for you to ask yourself some hard questions, Mr. Snow. We'll overlook the compromising of our New York lab. There are others, but do you really want to invite doom for yourself and others by continuing to investigate us? Do you really not remember us? Who benefits from your lack of memory? Who knows of the secret history of Elijah Snow? What are your teammates not telling you? And I guess that's the kind of implication that maybe who is the bad guys? The four or the four from Planetary? or are they
Well,
all bad guys?
and I do think that is there, though I do think it is undercut by them being super Nazis.
Yes. Right. That is a problem. So anyway, we have a new deepening of mysteries pointing more directly at Elijah Snow himself. Like the character who's trying to solve the mysteries is the mystery. He's kind of being forced to look at that fact, which he has never done of his own volition, right? He's never really in this comic said, "Who am I? Why am I? What's going on here?"
Right.
And he's only slightly admitted that he sometimes doesn't know. Anyhow, that's interesting. So, yeah, it was a very interesting issue. Very kind of told both an extremely inconclusive story and then a very complete story of the history of the Four and the secret world beyond. Secret world beyond the moon launch and everything that we know of.
Yeah, I mean, it's all there. There's a lot to unpack, but I think it's a lot of how you read it.
Yeah, at first I did not really enjoy this issue. It actually took a couple of readings. It was one of the harder issues for me to unpack at first. And I'm not sure why, because now it seems pretty clear to me. But the first time I read it, I maybe I was impatient and it was hard to read all the information they were throwing at you at once.
It's a dense issue.
Yeah. And I feel like it's well, in the very first issue, we had a brief appearance of an alternate world Justice League. But it's the first issue that's really focused on something that comes out of comics rather than movies or pulp fiction or that sort of thing.
But it also paints the comics in a villainous tone, whereas the pulp heroes are more virtuous.
Right.
And I find that notable.
Yes. And I think the issue next follows that pattern, because it also addresses comics and a comic book world of sorts.
More directly, I'd say.
Right. Well, yeah, more immediately apparent to the experienced comic book reader of Vertigo Comics. It's issue number 7 looks exactly like one of those Sandman or Hellblazer covers, with the kind of collaged, mysterious, dark look to it, with the mysterious writing on the cover, which you can sort of half read if you look closely. Faith, a singular piety towards... Anyway. So it looks like a cover of Hellblazer.
Yes.
Constantine. And also just evokes that kind of Sandman type of cover too.
Very Vertigo.
Extremely Vertigo. And it starts with Chiquita saying Jack Carter's dead.
And Drummer's happy about it.
Drummer's happy about it. He says, good. He's a scumbag. Whereas Chiquita says he's an old friend of ours who had a serious connection to the occult underground, real player in the 80s. And it seems like all of this, the thematic thing is London in the 80s. That's in Warren Ellis's mind, the core maybe of the Vertigo books. And I think he's including, because Vertigo didn't really start, I think, till 90 or 91. He's including the late 80s books and the early 90s books.
Well, because
there's a lot of late 80s books that we now think of as Vertigo that didn't have that label.
Yes.
Such as starting with the Swamp Thing, which I think actually started in the early 80s.
And introduced Constantine.
83 or so. Right, and Constantine came out of that. And so, yes, this Jack Carter guy turns out to basically be a stand-in for Constantine, at least at first.
Yeah. Yes.
So he doesn't have blonde hair, but he wears a trench coat and smokes a cigarette. Let's see what was her description of him. Jack was everything you wanted London to be. He was funny, smart, and mysterious, sexy and scary. And they have him, as he lights a cigarette, saying, "All right, Squire." And I'm trying to think of what Constantine always said. It was something similar, but I don't think it was Squire.
Snoochie Boochies.
And now I don't know. I've never heard this before, but she says, "You know what they say? If you're tired of London, you're tired of life. For me, Jack Carter was London."
Yeah, I don't know.
So I felt like that might be part of a Warren Ellis British kind of thing.
That's kind of what I thought. Is it felt like there was some Brit-centric feeling going here,
right?
Which is
presumably
fine.
Ironic. I assume he doesn't really think London is all of life, but maybe he does.
But I'm sure he heard someone say that. Like, I'm sure there's a few things you and I have heard of Chicago or New York that we would just take for granted. But if you went outside of the States, it would be
right. Particularly
odd.
About, for me, Chicago or LA or something. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, New York or LA. I'm trying to think of what things people say about Chicago. Well, the Windy City. But so we kind of get a back and forth between Chiquita, who has positive memories of this guy, and Drummer, who doesn't, and Elijah Snow, who apparently has no knowledge of him at all. As they wander through a graveyard, I presume somewhere in the London area where he's being buried.
Right.
And I guess he was sort of linked to Planetary in some way. Drummer says he was our window on England in the 80s. And maybe that means, that John Constantine was comic book readers' window on London. Although I imagine that Hellblazer was mostly a comic book of the 90s. But anyway, that's being picky. Lots of strange stuff went on here, even without the costume stuff. Costumed, there were superheroes in England? Sure, Jenny Sparks ran a team here in the 60s and again in the 80s. All went to hell, of course.
And again, our only Wildstorm connection is Jenny Sparks.
Right. Who's been referred to in a few other issues, hasn't she?
Yep. And
apparently we see a superhero fly across the moon while they're talking. Let's see. I think there's some holdovers from that too. One or two people wanting to do it right. You never quite get rid of the traditionalists. They're talking about superheroes, no matter how many condoms you sell. Jack let us in on that and all the other stuff. One of these days, you pains in the backside will speak a complete sentence that I don't have to ask another damn question about. Oh, that is winter talk. I mean, snow talking. And then as they continue, they walk past two characters who look suspiciously like Neil Gaiman's Sandman and Neil Gaiman's Death, sitting on a bench looking sad and feeding the pigeons.
Yep, being emo.
And isn't there a scene where Death shows up, where Death and Dream feed pigeons? I'm not sure.
There is.
And then we get to the funeral itself, and there's a gathering of the oddball Vertigo and others kind of characters from...
Others?
Well, like the Metal Men are there. I don't think they were ever Vertigo characters.
Is it just... I thought that was the Metal Men that were in Doom Patrol.
Did the Metal Men show up in Doom Patrol? I mean, there's Robot Man.
Maybe I'm confusing it.
Who, at first, I thought maybe that was Robot Man, the gold one, but then I see there's Platinum and Copper.
Oh, okay.
And then this might be a stand-in for the Demon, who did show up in occasional Vertigo Comics, although he was a Jack Kirby 1972 or 73 creation.
Well, right. I mean, Swamp Thing has
there's Swamp
been in
Thing
and
and there's
out.
Animal Man, or people
Yeah,
standing
they're
in for
purple.
them. There's other characters that I don't actually recognize. I think that's the Spectre back there.
Right. I'd be hard pressed to name a few more. I assume that's
yes.
Solomon Grundy.
Oh, Solomon Grundy, yeah. Is there a character like in the Doom Patrol or Invisibles with an upside down face? That just seems like a Grant Morrison type of thing.
Maybe.
And one, I only managed on the web to find a few notes, but someone said that Grant Morrison was standing in this crowd and claimed that next to the Animal Man character is Grant Morrison. And I don't know if that's correct. If this camera will focus on him. Yeah. Right there. Because I feel like Grant Morrison shows up later.
Right.
And I don't know. I never read Preacher. Is that related to Preacher? This guy giving the sermon?
That would make sense. There's a lot to spot. And we get a big Vertigo appearance at the end from
one of our favorites.
From Ellis, yeah.
So then Chiquita tells another story about one story that I want to say Constantine, but Jack Carter told her, where he's walking down the street and he meets a spook who's literally a spook, works for some British Secret Service, but he's also like a ghost or a ghostly figure. And he tells Jack Carter that he's off to kill a prostitute who's about to give birth to a Messiah. Am I right?
Yeah.
Does that sound right? And then apparently Jack Carter just casts a spell on him that traps the spook, or whatever he is, invisible man, ghostly man, next to this street corner. So he can't leave. He can't go off and commit his murder. And I guess he can't ever leave. And eventually he starves to death. So he wasn't really a ghost, because in the present, I guess it's not too far from the cemetery where this happened, because we walk by and we see a ghostly skeleton still on that street corner, presumably years later.
And that's playing off of Freak Street, right?
Tell me what Freak Street is.
Wasn't that a Vertigo book?
I don't know. It might have been. It says Greek Street. If there were, there were a lot of Vertigo books, and I don't know all of them.
What? Maybe it was just Greek Street. Yep, that was a Vertigo book.
There was a Vertigo book. Okay, interesting.
So that came out after this did.
Oh, funny. In the 2000s?
2009.
Was it by Warren Ellis?
Peter Milligan.
And it was Greek Street or Geek Street?
Greek.
Huh. So maybe Milligan was playing around with Ellis. So then they're walking around. They walk past that skeleton, and they're still talking. And then apparently, the drummer can also use his skill that helps him find machines and talk to patterns and mathematical things to find magic, which he explains is just the cheat codes of the world, as opposed to the cheat codes in a computer game or hacking a computer.
Right.
Magic is the cheat codes for the world, sending a signal to reality's operating system. See, and he uncovers one of those demonic stars inside a circle.
Pentagram.
Sorry?
It's a pentagram.
Pentagram, right. Sorry. Can't think of these names.
Just put it in.
So, and then I forget why, but Elijah Snow freezes the street.
Well, drummer's pulling it up, but he's having trouble getting the full residency. It'll be easier if it's colder.
He says, Snow, can you make it colder here? It might help settle down and cohere. And I found a couple things in this panel where we see a silent panel where he's frozen in the street is he managed to not freeze the spot where his two friends or colleagues are standing. So everything froze, but so he has very precise control of what he freezes. And the street sign says Moorcock, which is not a dirty thing. Michael Moorcock is a very famous British writer who likes comics. He created Elric and is probably friends with all these British comic book writers. And in England is quite respected as a literary writer, not for his Elric work, but for other things he's written. In America, he's not well known in the literary world. But so I just thought it was interesting they put a Moorcock Street in here. And I don't know if it's a reference to a scene in a Moorcock novel or anything like that here. And so after they do that, they find the sort of astral trace of the remains of Jack Carter, or the remains of a spell of Jack Carter faking his death.
Right.
And at that point, a giant, over-muscled, roided out Superman analog lands and says, "No, I won't have it. I won't have it. I killed him."
And this is where what I was talking about in the last issue comes forward, where if we go forward a page, he talks about how things used to be simple.
Right.
But he had this sexual orientation change. He had all these like horrible things happen to him to basically just make him more interesting, but made his life absolute misery, which is interesting because if you're thinking the 80s in comics.
Right. It's a reference to things that Frank Miller and Alan Moore did to superheroes in a sense, or kicked off doing the superheroes, I think. And sorry, go ahead.
And this plays to a line that Snow had earlier in the comic when we were looking at the Vertigo cast and said, don't they look a bit ridiculous? And Janika says, well, maybe now, but what ages that well over a decade? And it's about what they did in their time. Yeah. But now we're seeing someone who was from before that time, who had to live through that time.
And be transformed.
Right. And so that's an interesting pull for comics, which is in Planetary's world separated from the pulp characters in that way.
It's a very comical scene, although sad for this guy. I don't want to have to wake up in Soho with 12 volumed up rent boys and terrible stains on my tights. You didn't have to take the damn photographs. I didn't want to find out that instead of getting my powers from a transcendent scientist mentor, I was grown from the DNA of Aryan super athletes and Hitler's personal sex midgets. I didn't even know Hitler had personal sex midgets. So it's very over the top. And when they refer to that in England, there were some superheroes in the 60s and then again in the 80s, I think... Well, I saw someone online conjecturing that was a reference to Miracle Man, or Marvel Man, as he was originally called, who was around in the 60s and then was brought back in the 80s, where Alan Moore did all these things to him, made him grow up, so to speak.
But you could also point to Animal Man.
True, but Animal Man wasn't in England, was he?
No, but he's part of this Vertigo Mayu that we're playing in right now.
Well, true. But I was thinking they were saying, oh, there were superheroes in England? I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, not everything is one for one to each other, but it is, again, these desperate media connections played through with the theme and are all referenced within the comic. Again, it's...
Well, because of the Vertigo thing and the Alan Moore thing, I was thinking of the Miracle Man, Marvel Man thing made sense.
That makes sense.
Both a 60s and then a 80s comic that was purely in England, and most Americans didn't know it ever existed. But it could also be a reference to Animal Man.
Well, I'm saying it all works here, right? Like it all.
I mean, it also is just a reference in general to the late 80s deconstruction of superheroes. To the extreme in this case. I don't think Alan Moore even had any of his people wake out with a bunch of Thai what are they called? Thai rent boys. with terrible stains on his tights.
Well,
And then he gets shot and his guts blow out.
mhm.
And Jack shows up.
Right.
Only he looks entirely different.
But it's funny because, again, it's like a trench coat and the cigarette and all that.
Right. A different style of trench coat, though. Almost more of a Nazi trench coat or something. I don't know.
Or a duster.
Yeah. It's all buttoned over to the side and very tight. And anyway, so apparently he has shaved his head and put on this sort of different style coat. And my first thought is he looked like a latter day Grant Morrison.
Okay.
Because of that bald head and kind of a severe look. Like I'm kind of a bit of more of an oddball or something. I don't know the right way to put that.
Cue ball.
So all of this, his death was faked so that he could entrap this Superman-like character and kill him. Although, given how easy the Superman character was to kill, it seems a bit elaborate. But anyway, it gave Warren Ellis an excuse to do his semi-piss take on all of the Vertigo comics. And then he throws away that trench coat and reveals himself to just be wearing a suit jacket and black pants with no shirt and have a tattoo over his chest that makes him look suddenly a lot like Spider. What's Spider's name?
Jerusalem.
Spider Jerusalem from Transmetropolitan.
Right. Which is weird because that means we're taking Constantine basically and then turning him to
Spider Jerusalem.
Yeah, to Spider Jerusalem, which was also Ellis, and moving that forward. It's a weird take, but what's also interesting is it makes those tattoos kind of bring on a mystical feel or idea.
Right.
As opposed to just being
And it seems like he's telling us, those of us who know enough about his work, that my Transmetropolitan transcends above the Vertigo books that it came out of.
I don't know if
it's time to move on from your Constantines and your Swamp Things to Spider Jerusalem and Transmetropolitan.
Well, I wonder if that's what he's saying, as much as what he's saying here is more like my work in Transmet may not hold up 10 years from now, but it was representative of the time that it was in. Much like Vertigo
he physically is having it replace a leading Vertigo character. Right? But he's having a leading Vertigo character turn into his character.
But all that change is tied to a new decade, and we have very these marked moments in time coming through with the Century Babies, and now this, and it's like this is Vertigo was the 80s, Transmet was very clearly in the 90s, and so is this new era.
Right. So, of course, a lot of Vertigo that he's making fun of really was in the 90s, but he was the late 90s and they were the early 90s, I suppose.
Yeah, which makes it even weirder. So,
but he says the 80s are long over. Time to move on. Time to be someone else.
Right.
So, anyway, it's perfectly fine that he's doing this, but I just think it's a bit egotistical or kind of perhaps just poking fun at his fellow writers. I mean, obviously, at this point, Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore were still active comic book writers. Maybe not Neil Gaiman, I'm not sure. But
yeah, I don't think so.
He probably saw them at conventions, or at least Neil Gaiman, who I know is quite active in going to conventions and stuff.
Since Denver.
Not since what?
I said unless it's Denver, he pulled out because whatever. So
because he heard we were going to be there.
He was going to be, and then he pulled out after we announced it. It was
and you had paid him a lot of money. Was that?
We had to raise some god awful amount of money, and it was all going to go to a charity. But in order for him to look at an appearance, you have to put up a serious amount of money so that it's not some flippant thing, I guess. But
so I just did a quick flick over to Wikipedia, and Transmetropolitan ran from 1997 to 2002, and this comic came out in 2000. So in a sense,
oh geez, that does make it even more.
He's plugging his. So he is. I mean, it started in 97 and went to 2002. So he is thinking of Spider Jerusalem as the character of right now when he was writing it.
Yeah,
so
that's
I mean, it's
ballsy.
for us, it's all fun, but it is kind of funny thinking of how he's tooting his own horn in a different comic.
It is.
And of course, Grant Morrison is still around now to some extent, and was definitely very active at this point. He was this around the time when he was doing those seven Soldiers of Victory or something like that.
Somewhere in around there, yeah.
And then he says, "Cheers, I'll be seeing you," and he walks off into the shadows. So this may be either just a fun jaunt for Warren Ellis to take an issue off to play and make a joke on Vertigo, or maybe he's setting this character up to be a player later. Again, if I ever knew, I can't recall.
Yeah.
So those are two comics in a row, I guess, that make fun of comics. Much more making fun of Vertigo than the Fantastic Four, really, even though the Fantastic Four are evil Nazis.
Right. Well, the tone's so much lighter in here. It feels more like parody, more like poking fun, and playing with the characters more directly. Like this was Constantine by another name.
Exactly. It was so close, and made fun of, especially just all the other characters besides Constantine. Just were this goofy, according to them, goofy looking group of people. Now the Swamp Thing has a woman growing out of him, and
Poison Ivy?
Was there a time when Poison Ivy was physically latched onto him, or is that just a goof that maybe John Cassaday was playing?
Who knows? I think the red hair makes it pretty clear it's supposed to be Ivy, though.
Yeah. And I'm noticing now, looking back at that big group picture of all the Vertigo characters, one of them, it looks like maybe a tree is growing out of a suit. I didn't notice that before. Anyway, just another sign of how I keep seeing more stuff every time I look through it. Both of these issues had brilliant work by Cassaday. And he's constantly, and who knows how much was in the script by Ellis, but he's constantly sort of doing different things with different kinds of scenes. And so it's like the artist and the colorist have really thought about how to present different parts of the story. And so at times when I feel a little annoyed with Ellis, I feel like the art can carry me through. Like in the Fantastic Four issue, I got a little bogged. Like I said, it took me a while. I got a little bogged down, but the art was so great.
Yeah, the art in this series is fantastic, which, given where these people were in their careers at the time, was just even a bigger stroke of luck. Like,
yeah,
you rarely get anything this next level.
Very, very true. And I don't, is this the peak for Cassaday, or did he, I mean, I remember enjoying his artwork in the Joss Whedon series he did, and in a few other Marvel things I've seen him do. I guess I haven't seen a lot of his work outside of those two pieces, Planetary and Astonishing X-Men.
Yeah, I mean, he's done a handful of other things, but I mean, those are his biggest works. And funnily enough, Joss Whedon did an intro to the second volume of Planetary, which
you have
the 7th issue was in. Yeah.
And that probably was published before Astonishing.
Yeah, I believe so, though I have to believe that there had to have been some rumblings or something that was part of the reason it happened. Because before that, I don't know what would prompt them to get him to do a comic book forward, or how they'd bother to get him.
And even if maybe the Astonishing X-Men took a while, was in planning, but it wouldn't. That was Marvel, and this is DC.
Mm-hmm. But
there is an announcement in one of these issues of Planetary from Jim Lee. Oh no, it's in the next issue. It's in issue 8 that we're not covering till next episode. But where Jim Lee says we've now successfully merged with DC.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, so continues to be very. I keep waiting for like a shoe to drop. Like, what if I don't love Planetary as much as I think? But so far, I'm feeling good about it.
I feel like even if you don't love this as much as you think, there's so much in every issue, and there's so many details and nuances to like pick out that even if you don't love some of the plot, some of the telling, some of the storytelling, some of the art is going to more than carry you through than a number of other things. And also when issues are this tight, I don't know, it's just hard to not appreciate just the craft alone. I don't know, it's interesting because I was looking at the publication date, and I mean, this comic was always a slow burn. So
you mean in terms of how long it took each issue to come out?
Yeah, at its most regular was bi-monthly.
Yeah, let's see. Issue 6 is listed at November 1999. And issue 7 in the indicia is January 2000. So that's bi-monthly, I guess. November to January.
Mm-hmm.
Ellis was doing a lot. So at this time, he was writing Planetary. He was still writing Authority. And he was writing Transmetropolitan. And who knows what else he was writing. But that's 3 major things going on at the same time.
Yeah, I think he was done with Stormwatch.
Right. Well, didn't Stormwatch turn into Authority, or was he writing 2 titles in that?
Well, Authority came out of Stormwatch, and particularly his run of Stormwatch, but Stormwatch continued after him, I think.
Okay. Well, that makes sense.
I think.
Yeah.
I could swear it did. Stormwatch was the longest running Wildstorm title, I believe, except for Wildcats. And I think it went further than Wildcats, but I'd have to look it up. But that's a long run.
Right. I'm trying to look on Wikipedia here to see dates of what was going on with Stormwatch, but it doesn't say. It does say Authority was a spin-off of Stormwatch. Excuse me.
A good one, too.
Yes. Well, anyway, this was great. Thanks for staying up late to talk about this with me.
Mm-hmm.
We one of the problems of doing this podcast is the only time we're both free at the same time is usually after 10 o'clock Matt's time and after 9 o'clock my time. So we're always a little tired as we're doing it.
We're sleepy readers.
We're both sleepy readers, yes. So next time we will do issue 8 and 9. I think we're returning to other genres outside of comics.
Mm-hmm.
At least in issue 8. I'm not sure what's in issue 9.
Yeah, but it should be a fun jaunt. And then we're looking at crossovers.
The one kind of reader who might not like Planetary is someone who really loves the stories of character, because this is so much more about like what ideas will they play with next. I feel there's a little character in the background, but not a lot.
I could see a lot of people not liking Planetary, because I feel like to appreciate Planetary, you kind of have to have an understanding of kind of the pulp characters and a fair amount of like comic history and or
That's
just
true.
pop culture history. Like this is very much a comic for adults and not in the way that's normally meant at all. But I think you need to have absorbed a lot of ideas and culture to kind of get where this is going. And
True.
without those threads,
And issue 7, I
don't know what
suppose,
to-
wouldn't, if this was one of the first comics you read and you hadn't known all about Hellblazer and Sandman and Animal Man, you might think this is a pretty darn strange and confusing comic.
Well, and I mean, we're comic book super fans, basically.
Right.
I mean, even if you had a passing knowledge of Constantine, I think that'd be enough to at least appreciate it on some level.
Right. But there are people who don't have a past, especially at this point in time. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you could imagine this Planetary series, because it's so highly rated, falling into someone's lap who's maybe only read one or two other sort of well-known graphic novels and gives this a try.
Well, it was a book I was afraid to return to for a long time because I kept feeling like I need to reread Planetary when I already know everything and I can come back and appreciate all the nuances. What's funny is I'm reading it now, and the issues where it's in my wheelhouse, I feel like I'm getting everything. I know there's like a couple Vertigo bits I missed.
Mm-hmm.
Like some of those characters, I didn't know necessarily who they were, or whatnot. And I also knew enough to know that it was Vertigo that they were going for specifically. I mean, that's a big key in.
Because maybe you didn't know that Vertigo cliched cover look the first time you read it. I don't know.
And that would be really hard to come to now, even if you were catching up on Constantine, Lucifer, and Sandman and all that. The covers aren't necessarily in the collections.
Oh.
And so when Connect and the trade covers are a completely different style.
Yeah. That's true. I've got all of the Sandman Absolutes. I'm going to look at those. But of course, that wouldn't, the average person would get the paperback trade.
But do you have the Absolutes and the annotated? I haven't read these.
I do not have the annotated, so you have upped me on the Sandman.
I went deep on Sandman. I got the Absolutes, I got the annotations, and then I think it's 3 books about Sandman.
Well, that's nice. Sandman's good that way, that there's so many books about it.
Right.
It's achieved that level. I do wish there was, like we've said before, something. I have found a book of essays about Planetary.
Oh, that'd be excellent.
And so I got it on Kindle and I've started reading it. But each article covers the entirety of Planetary. And since I'm trying not to spoil what's coming, I started like skimming through this article, looking when they mentioned issue 1 or 2 or 3 or something. But, I see issue 20. I'm not looking at that. No. So it doesn't go issue by issue. It's like,
might be worth waiting to read that one.
Right. Maybe we'll talk about that I'll talk about that when we get to the end. Another interesting thing is, I mean, I haven't edited up to this point. I haven't edited any of these episodes yet, so none of them are out. Good. But I mentioned on one of my vlogs on my YouTube channel that we were working on this project, and I got a lot of comments from people who said, "Oh, I read part of Planetary, didn't finish it, and it's a great book, and I've always meant to get back to it." And I'm excited you're doing it as a podcast. That'll force me to read it. So there's something about the density of it that makes it, perhaps. Of course, there's also the timing of the way it came out.
Well, outside of Planetary, can you think of a number of books that are, I don't know, intimidating to approach? Because I feel like it's relatively unique in that I feel almost everyone holds it in a certain light that almost makes it harder to read.
Right.
Because you can't just read an issue of Planetary. You have to do your homework.
Right. And I think also, if you stop reading it, I mean, there's other books that are like this, but if you stop reading it, you very much feel like you have to go back to the beginning, because if you've read part of it, you realize, there's clues throughout that I need to remind myself of.
Right. And that's interesting. And it's funny because reading it now, I think this is as far as I ever got.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm really interested to read more. And I never read any of the crossovers. So I'm really excited to get there. And I don't know. It's actually been a lot more approachable than I thought. Oh, and that's what I want to ask is you got the absolutes of Sandman, but I thought you didn't like Gaiman or Sandman.
I guess I lied about it. I never didn't like Sandman.
You think it's overrated or?
I used to think it was overrated. I used to
I
think
mean-
it was, well, this was my snobbery in the 90s. I'm a bit embarrassed by it now, actually. I used to think there really isn't any good writing in comics, and that Gaiman is the best of a bad lot.
Okay.
Or that he's overrated. He's an interesting but flawed writer is probably what I really thought. And then when I read his prose, I thought it was very middle of the road in terms of the prose I normally read.
That's fair.
And he got a lot of accolades for it. And I realized that he was a very adept networker.
Mhm.
And around that time, I was beginning to form because I was trying to become a science fiction writer, form my dislike of the success of people who were good at networking in the world of sci-fi and fantasy.
Okay.
So he actually is to be admired on one level because he had this hugely successful career in comics, and he took a huge risk and kind of threw himself into the science fiction fantasy world. And when he started out, I don't think he had that much name recognition there, but he networked like crazy, and his pictures would be everywhere at all the big conventions and stuff, standing next to all the right people. And then he started winning a lot of awards for things that I thought were kind of So now I kind of have revised my thinking on him, and I feel like his comic book writing is pretty good, at least a lot of it, and that I am less enamored with his prose.
Well, I can see a lot of what you're saying, and I think there's a few factors there. Seeing creators like that when you're getting the side bit, which you've spoken about before in a number of times about why you kind of don't follow creators and whatnot, because you want to enjoy the work. You don't want to get caught up in the
right, like meeting creators in person and stuff.
And I feel like this is related to that.
Yeah,
that kind of
or following them on Twitter or whatever. I just follow fellow comic book fans and not the creators.
Right. And
I don't ever try to like get creators to come watch my videos or listen to my podcast as I say good things about them or whatever. I'm not wanting their attention. I'm wanting the attention of my fellow readers and not the other creators.
Well, when Warren Ellis listens to all our podcasts, I'm sure that will crack. But
well, he may have nothing else to do right now. That's a bitter laugh, Warner. If you're listening, we want you to write more.
Yeah. I do enjoy Sandman, at least half of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot there, and I think there's a lot to respect. But I've also heard a lot of the criticisms, and God, I wish I could find this article again. There was the article, I don't know if I agree with it, but it was an incredibly written thing that was an argument that the image revolution in the 90s saved us from comics all becoming more pretentious like Sandman. Because that was like
funny. I now view it as the reverse.
Well, yes.
I feel like Vertigo saved us from Image destroying comics for good.
Which is weird now because Image is more
like Vertigo now.
Yeah. And the article was really interesting in that it was talking about like taking all these crazy ideas. And the other thing to that article that I found interesting is it was kind of pointing to the idea that people talk about this early Image stuff, and a lot of it was horrible. for about 3 to 10 issues, depending on the run. But if you kept going with it, there was usually more there. I mean, Spawn, definitely people have found stuff
But
in that.
most of
Wildcats
them,
got
maybe not
better.
Spawn, but most of them took so long to come out that by the time 10 issues came out, they had already killed the comics industry. Or
Yes.
killed is, I'm being dramatic, but they had already reached the point where the comics industry was kind of collapsing in on itself.
And this article was not talking about industry. It was talking about art.
Right.
So, yes. And that's the thing. Like I said, I don't necessarily agree with it. And there's all these factors and ideas going into that, which relates to what we were talking about here. Aren't these guys goofy?
Right.
This is the new era of comics and whatnot. But I think there's this kind of weird battle that was waged in comics that we let go around the time Planetary was going. But Planetary seems very kind of mired in this idea of the goofy and the pretentious and the high-minded and the low-minded of the art, in kind of pop culture versus high culture.
Right.
In a way. And it used to be a much bigger deal. And at this point, I don't think that's a factor. I don't think that's an issue anymore.
You mean in a lot of areas, pop culture and high culture have interleaved much more, and it's no longer separated from each other?
I would argue high culture has lost, and pop culture
high
has
culture's
won.
just disappeared. Yeah.
It was obliterated and shot and exploded and killed and yeah.
But if you were in a creative writing program at one of the top schools, they would still say the high culture exists and ignore the low culture that you and I love so much.
Would they? I don't think that's true of colleges anymore.
I assume they do, but
I don't. That wasn't. I mean, I didn't go to a high level college.
Right. I'm thinking of
college,
if you studied creative writing at Stanford or something like that.
Well, yeah, but I hear, because we have access to people who are tastemakers and people who are in the orbit of the Ivy League schools through things like TED Talks and the New Yorker and whatnot. And the way that they talk about things and how they're approaching culture now is very different than it was even 10 years ago.
So maybe I'm just out of the loop on that.
Maybe. I just, we hear so much, but it's all related through things that are more accessible. And the way that we talk about the importance of culture and what it is much more about accessibility and diversity. And the term diversity doesn't mean what it meant 10 years ago.
Right.
And so that's playing into this book too. If Planetary was made today, you wouldn't have 3 white characters of Anglo-Saxon descent be the globe-trotting group.
That is interesting. That's an interesting point. Although I feel we're in a transitionary time where some things do that better than others. Because I was watching Dune on TV, the new Dune. They do have one of the major characters, or not, one of the secondary major characters,
right,
is a black woman instead of a white man, as he probably was in the first movie. But if you really took Dune seriously, I think, as just drawing from the novel, the characters, all of them could be mixed races of various types. Instead, you still have mostly white characters with a few nods to diversity.
Well, maybe. That's an interesting intersection. I
was watching Dune and I was surprised because here was an opportunity, a book that takes place 10,000 years from now. And so And it's not like people can say, hey, in the book it specifically says they're all white men. It doesn't. So you could put in anything. Anyway, but you're basically right. I mean, it would be quite noticeable. The whole concept of thinking about diversity of your cast is really very new, even though there have been nods to it, on and off since the 60s maybe, but just mere brief nods here and there.
Well, I think there's that, but I also think like Planetary's playing in a milieu that made sense. But again, if it was written today, on top of the character bit that I mentioned, I feel like there would be a lot more push to go more global with it, because this is very comfortable to stay in the literary English pop English tradition.
Right. Although we went to
going
Japan
to-
and then to Hong Kong in the second and third issue.
We did, though
All
there
through
was
the point of view of white people, but
well, and the third issue in particular is it exoticism? Maybe. I mean, you have a point, and we have only read so many. I mean, it's majority
right
one way, but you are right. And I don't know, but I also feel like if this was written out, we would have been to Africa. We would have been
Right.
to
India,
the Middle East.
The Middle East. All of those places would be obvious draws of, huge wells of wonderful fictional worlds.
Right.
Latin America, has full of it also. I mean, everywhere has a rich cultural stuff going on.
But it's harder to tie that thread the way that this book's written, because in order to play that through, there are more similarities because it is more similar. And it's playing through the times along with the culture. But if you start going that global, I feel like for what's going here, you'd lose the thread.
Yeah, in terms of those two issues that took place in different Asian countries, all of that was stuff that any slightly adventurous white pop culture person would have known about in the 90s.
Well, I mean,
that's when I learned about the Hong Kong movies. There were suddenly these Hong Kong movie festivals sometime in the mid 90s. And of course, the Godzilla movies go back much further in the white consciousness.
Well, and everybody's heard of a Godzilla movie. Everybody's heard of a John Woo movie or whatever, right? Like, it's not...
Well, no, at one point, I think it was a John Woo movie was still for just a small number of aficionados in the 90s. So it's much more obvious now that people would know a John Woo movie than back then.
I mean, once you get to Mission Impossible 2, I mean, there's that John Woo scene, and that was like...
When did Mission Impossible 2 come out?
That was late 90s.
I think it in my experience, there was a sudden awareness of Hong Kong movies in the mid 90s, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, well, it tied into the rise of anime.
It very rapidly moved to Hollywood, and they hired John Woo to come do things in Hollywood at some point.
Yeah, well, it's the same reason. So, like, it's periods of access, and that's a big part of global penetration of media. And so, I mean, at the same time, anime and manga was rising because you had stuff come over because it was easy to do via the internet or DVDs, because you didn't have to hard sub everything. You could soft sub, and you had the discs, which were cheaper and easier to move and easier to pirate. Things move through. Actually, it'd be really interesting at that point to talk about piracy, because especially with Hong Kong movies, the piracy movement of it brought it through across the globe, basically, because they were just selling things at cost. So,
but I don't know if it was just local to me or something traveling around the country, but someone was packaging lots of Hong Kong movies together for art house theaters in the 90s, when there still were art house theaters.
It was the American arm. They were literally pushing to do that, because with visibility came sales, and with such an increase of sales, the money came through. And Yeah.
It looks like John Woo's first American movie was in 96. So I guess awareness might have happened prior
would
to
have been
that, or at least awareness in
before.
Hollywood. And then
Well,
Face
and
Off was 97 and Mission Impossible was 2000. So Mission Impossible 2.
right.
Poor John Woo, though. I don't feel like I feel bad. I think he would have been better staying in Hong Kong. But I don't feel like Hollywood movies served him that well.
Well, Hollywood's bad for action. So.
Yes. Anyway, we're way off track, but in talking about that, I thought it was odd to say I don't know how I perceived Vertigo books in 2000, although I don't think I perceived them as goofy as Warren Ellis thinks of them. But I look back at them now as being really important and cool and not at all something to be made fun of.
It was also a brand of Vertigo that he's poking fun of here. It was the part that intersected with DC. It wasn't so much Preacher or Transmet, which he thinks is apparently the greatest thing, but the Animal Mans and the Swamp Things and
and somehow the Metal Man got stuck in there. Yeah, but I still think, I don't buy his argument that it was a goofy time or anything. I feel like it was the opposite. Maybe I'm just seeped in nostalgia or something. But
well, I think it's also kind of that idea, if you pull back, because we're so used to seeing superheroes and all that, but if you pull back and look at Batman, he looks pretty goofy.
Oh yeah. No, I could see that. And the goofiest thing in here was the Superman analog.
Mm-hmm.
He was very funny and embarrassing. But so I think I just perceive it differently than Warren Ellis does.
It's fair.
And as I was kind of hinting, I kind of think, we had this huge boom in comics that resulted in Image and this focus on artists, and then the focus on artists kind of caused the ship to almost sink. And it was the Vertigo style focus on writers that kind of helped comics survive this kind of dead zone. And an interesting thing is right now there's a big revival of people's interest in the early Image stuff, with a huge revival of Spawn, and suddenly the value of early Image comics that were 50 cent or dollar books has now gone up and all of that. So it probably comes in waves. Like I was probably sneering at the early Image books a few years after they failed or they sort of disappeared from the scene. And now that so much time has passed, it's easier for some people and me to some extent to see what was good about them. And so maybe the kind of Vertigo books that he's making fun of were so recent to him that it was easier for him to sneer at them than he might now.
Well, it's funny because in this book they talk about generations, but he talks about it in a decade sense.
Right.
But generational in most conscious collective thought is at 30 years, and that Image stuff was just about 30 years ago.
Right.
And so we're looking at that point where it is very much past. And I think part of the reason it's easier to appreciate and look at it is something I thought about a lot after going back and reading The Superior Spider-Man. When it was coming out, it gave me hives.
Right.
Because I wanted to read Spider-Man. And it wasn't. But looking back at it now, it's a great run. There's a lot of good things there. It's really interesting. It's a great diversion. But, it's great to read now. But January, February, March, for 3 years going, not having Spider-Man when I'm picking up Spider-Man was not what I wanted. And I think there's something very different when you're reading a story in comics that has been and is interesting to talk about versus the thing that you're going to be dealing with for the next year or several years looking forward. It's a different mentality. It's about what are you excited for versus what's a good story. And those can be two very different things.
Exactly. And when you look back at something 20 years later, 30 years later, you're reading it as, oh, here's something interesting from the past that I can look at. Not here's something that is interplaying with my current expectations month to month, as you were referring to before. And that may be part of why I have a higher opinion of Gaiman's comics now than I did when Sandman was still going on. And there were ups and downs. I would be, oh, here's some really good issues. And then I'd read a few more issues and these seem kind of weak. But read as a whole, they don't seem as weak, or they seem part of a bigger picture about, the comics of the past.
Well, and in Sandman in particular, Gaiman would go, the way he framed it as per his notes was there's one male story and then one female story. But when anybody's talking about Sandman, they're talking about the ones that involve Morpheus by and large, which were the male stories, and not the ones involving Sissy and Gabrielle and those characters primarily. There's deviations on both sides, but by and large. And
I wasn't aware of any pattern going on.
Right.
When I was reading
and
them,
it breaks. But that's how he was going about it. And I think now, going reading these smaller stories and then seeing it in the tapestry, more connections can be made and enjoyed.
Right.
But if you're sitting there for 3 months reading this story that you're like, I want to be reading about these characters and these greater ideas, not this like human drama about some junkie.
Yeah, like if you've just read Seasons in the... No, it's not called Seasons of
Seasons
Mist.
of the Mist, yeah.
If you just read that, and then suddenly he switches gears, even if it's good, it's hard for you as the reader at the time. You thought you had a grasp of what Sandman was. But when you look back on it as a whole, you have a different grasp of what Sandman is, and you're just saying, oh, here's an interesting piece there, interesting piece there.
God, do we have to do Sandman after Planetary now?
I don't think I could stand to do the entirety, but it'd be fun to pick out some bits of Sandman to chat about.
I feel like we'd do arcs. You would only, if you do it like
pick
that
some
way,
arcs or some of the one and done ones too. In my memory, those are some of my favorites.
I mean, there are. Yeah, you're right. I don't.
Or
yeah, that would be a chore.
For myself, we could do a reread. I could do a reread of Sandman, and every now and then you and I could dip in and talk about some part of it.
I can't.
Within the context of that reread.
I can't casually approach that thing.
I just think if we tried to take on all of Sandman as a podcast, that would be many years.
That's fair. Yeah, never mind. Scrap that idea. We'll do.
No. I'm intrigued. I just think we could figure out a way to just do it arc by arc.
Yeah, well,
more quickly.
Either way, there should be something in between. Something fun
cleanser.
And punchy.
Like some early Stormwatch or early Fire or Wildcats or something. I'm teasing you.
Not too early. Not too early. All right, are we just going to do all the Wildstorm comics? There you go.
I'm trying to find Alan Moore Wildstorm. It's not easy.
What did he do? Because he did Wildcats and then he did a couple issues.
So I just found one issue of Wildcats that he did. So I have one issue that he did. I don't know how many he did.
Not a ton. And
10,
if you don't read
9.
them in order, yeah.
I know. I know. So I have to look for the rest. I found it in a 50-cent bin, but it was all by itself. And I spent another 20 minutes searching through the bins around it, hoping there were some other Alan Moore Wildstorm. But instead, or Alan Moore Wildcats. Instead, there were millions of copies of Wildcats 1, 2, and 3, and then almost nothing else.
And those aren't worth reading.
I assume not.
But you could own them.
The art alone makes my skin crawl.
It's Jim Lee, baby. Hush. Yes. Everybody loves Hush. That's what we should do. Batman Odyssey.
I have all the issues from a 50-cent bin. I don't know if I'll ever read them.
I have a trade. I think it would be just a treat.
Yes. Okay. We'll do that. Issue by issue.
No, God.
A 2-hour episode on each issue. And then we perhaps will stay dead.
Then we do Batman All-Star.
I've never finished reading that.
Really?
The Jim Lee, Frank Miller Batman All-Star? No.
How can you not? Oh, that thing is
I think I read one issue when it was coming out or something.
oh my God, it's so fascinating.
Well, maybe we should do that as our palate cleanser before we go on.
Yeah, my recommendation there is to just skim. You know?
Okay, well, we will be back from the dead soon, and we will do issues 8 and 9 of Planetary, and there will be even more to come after that. We're having fun.
Yeah. Ooh.